Go back to our main story tonight. The arrival of President Cyril Ramaphosa in St. Petersburg ahead of the second Russia-Africa summit. The two-day event, which was first held in October 2019, aims to strengthen political security as well as other areas of cooperation. Our reporter Ziyanda Ngcobo is live in St. Petersburg tonight. Ziyanda, let's talk about the level of cooperation that South Africa will be seeking with the Russians this week.
Well, it's not just South Africa, Tembegile, it's also a 49-fold African delegation that will be seeking then to strengthen those relations. I mean, the discussions will include mining, security, arms deals, and of course grain. You'll know that this summit is taking place during a very interesting time, Tembegile, in terms of the geopolitical landscape, whether you're talking about the recent suspension of that Russian Black Sea grain deal, or whether you talk about, the U.S. and China tensions and the impact that would have on a summit such as this, of course, given the fact that there is still that ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And so let's not waste any more time to begin. Let me bring in then the Department of International Relations and Cooperation Minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor. Thank you for your time live from St. Petersburg. And one of the key things that we'd like to know is that as the government of South Africa, but of course being a part of that Africa Peace Initiative, what are the key things that you're seeking to get out of the summits that are more tangible, given the level of criticism that's been waged against South Africa for coddling Russia, but in terms of economic benefit, very minimal?
Well, good evening and thank you for the opportunity. I think it's important to always stress that Russia as a nuclear power doesn't require coddling from South Africa or any other country. I think it's a country that stands for itself and that is able to manage its own affairs. As African countries, we're really here to continue the strengthening of cooperation between countries on the continent and the Russian Federation. We had begun these discussions several years ago. We had anticipated to meet much sooner, but of course we had the intervening period of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you've already indicated, there are really three key thematic areas, and our approach is always to look at these in terms of Agenda 2063, the African Union program for the development of the African continent. So matters of security would really be approached from the aspect of us wanting to silence the guns on the continent. And then with respect to matters of digital security, we have a significant concern about both developing digital technologies on the continent, but also ensuring that we're not open to invidious attacks such as cyber attacks and a whole range of hacking that often occurs and for which many of our countries do not yet have the technical capability. So we are discussing digital development and sharing of digital competence and innovation. And then I think people-to-people exchange is also very, very important. There are a number of side events, and this summit is unusual from the Sochi one, in that in terms of sectoral representation, it's much broader. There are some state-owned companies from South Africa and other African countries that are present here, financial institutions. I met the Vice President of Afri-Exim Bank, which is doing a lot on infrastructure and renewable energy resources on the African continent. And then I also met a number of private sector companies that trade, have business links with mining companies and investors from the Russian Federation. So it's a broad spectrum of issues that would be addressed that seek to advance the relationship beyond its current status.
And Minister, as I've already mentioned, the summit is taking place during a very interesting time in the world's history in terms of just the current conflict that's taking place between Russia and Ukraine, but also, the way in which South Africa has also managed its diplomatic relations. And, there's been a report that the U.S. in particular, from the Kremlin, is saying the U.S. and France have deliberately trying to put pressure on some of those who are here from Africa, the 49 African countries. Has South Africa experienced that kind of pressure? And what is your view? Because you've mentioned Agenda 2063, so you'd have to speak in one voice.
Well, you would know I have a disdain for bullying. And so absolutely no approach to South Africa to dissuade us. In fact, I've had messages from some of my colleagues of the G7 countries requesting us to raise the matter of the Black Sea grain deal and the pause to the past agreement, which just ended a short while ago. So we are certainly going to raise that through our president. You would recall that in June, following the 6 presidents who were part of the Africa Peace Initiative, we had agreed that we would come back in July and that we anticipate that on the return of the presidents to Russia, we would get some responses from the president of the Russian Federation concerning those 10 issues that had been tabled by the African presidents. One of them does include the grain deal. So we're hoping that our leaders can, follow through on those issues, and that President Putin will give them a response on how he intends to act on what they called the confidence-building measures, such as the matter of the release of prisoners, the return of the children to the Ukraine, and of course addressing the continuing export of grain to other parts of the world, including the African continent. Because when we were here, we said we don't only speak for Africa, we speak for the global community that needs food security. So I'm hopeful that with the promised meetings which are on the agenda of President Ramaphosa, we will begin to see some positive outcome with respect to the initiative that uniquely African leaders have set in motion.
All right, so that's the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation there, Thembekile. Plenty to come over the next 2 days, as she's touched on one of the critical things that's likely to be discussed, that being of food security, which would be very important for African leaders, given the fact that, most countries on the continent are facing a cost of living crisis, including our own. So the negotiations that take place here are very broad and vast.
Ziyanda, Ngcobo live for us in St. Petersburg, Russia, with full coverage of the Russia-Africa Summit through into the weekend. Ziyanda, thank you very much for that update for now.